thing that I do is I work with children and young people that struggle with voices and visions. I also work in prisons, and I guess this talk is inspired by both of those works, in that a lot of the young people I support hear quite violent and distressing voices, and in prisons, well, actually people can go to prison and hear voices for all kinds of reasons, but I've also worked with people who've acted on those violent voices. And I kind of wanted to make that clear so that you don't get the impression that I'm taking this lightly and that there are no risks and there's nothing to worry about. It's a complicated and quite an emotive issue. I'm also somebody who hears voices myself, as many of you know, and some of my voices are particularly violent and taboo and say things that I wouldn't say in polite circles. During this talk, I'm going to assume this isn't a polite circle and that I can be quite open. Having said that, I will be mindful because talking about this stuff is difficult sometimes. I just want to, before I start, I want to give a bit of a shout out to people that are probably still in bed or doing other things, but my talk isn't all about me, honest. It's about the Voice Collective project, Minding Camden, the Hearing Voices Network, Intervoice, ISPS, and all these amazing organisations that give me the chance to have awesome conversations like I had last night. And so you'll recognise things from what I say in conversations you've had with others. We don't own this narrative, we share it and we create it as we go. And obviously, a lot of the youth work that I do is founded on Sandra Escher's work, who'll be speaking this afternoon, so thank you guys. With that in mind, what am I doing? Switching on this for a start. There we go. I'll tell you a little bit about Voice Collective just to set the scene. We launched it back in 2009. We do peer support groups for children and young people that have voices and visions, creative arts workshop, because sometimes talking isn't enough, which is a great title for one of the papers or workshops in this conference. We do individual and family support, in person, on the phone, and often by email, because that's where young people have felt able to disclose a lot of their most overwhelming voices. We do liaison in schools, we do information resources, including our website, and we do a lot of training and mentoring for parents, youth workers, CAMs, anyone that will listen to us or talk with us. But we're not mental health professionals, we're not trained therapists, we're just people. But I think there is space for people in this as well. And I think voice hearing itself is still very much a taboo. When we set up the project, we went around naively saying, hey, we're starting Voice Collective, you know, getting young people together to talk about voices. And the overwhelming response from youth services, not CAMs, but say self-harm, eating distress, counselling projects was, we don't have that kind of young person here, you know, go to CAMs, speak to early intervention. And we know actually from the research that lots of young people experience this, yet it seemed that no one knew where they were. It's like they were hiding under the chair or the table. We'll see they're hiding in plain sight, it's just we don't always recognise or ask or think it's even possible. But I asked a young person about this, and we had this nice chat, and he very sensibly said, no, Rachel, it's not that there's a stigma about talking about voices at school, it's just that no one even thinks to talk about it. It's not even in the room or the playing field, it's on another universe for other people. So it's not like people are not talking about it because they're trying not to talk about it, it just doesn't even come into consciousness. And so I guess what we try and do at Voice Collective is really promote a common sense approach that enables people to start thinking about it and how it might apply to schools and how it might apply to youth services and youth groups. And we do that by really promoting this human approach. It fits in really nicely with the theme of the conference, I think, because it's about narrative, story, getting conversations going. And I guess we're kind of good at that, which is nice. And I think the facts help us present this very human approach. I think that voice hearing is a relatively common experience. I know if I did the whole cheesy hearing voices network vibe where we get people to stand up if you've never heard voices, and then we read out common experiences, and by the end of it there's like 3 or 4 poor souls standing up who've never had anything like that. And most of us would be going, actually 1 or 2 experiences in my life could be called voice hearing. So it is common. But it's especially common in children and adolescents. And I think the idea that every young person that hears voices has a story is also useful. If you go into a school and say this person is hearing voices, sometimes that school will go, oh no, we can't support that here, that's too much. But actually if you go, this person is hearing voices and they've been bullied and they're hearing people that are bullying them as well, and they're quite frightened and overwhelmed and they find it difficult in school and in class, but there's things you can do, and this is how it evolved, and the young person's involved in the conversation as well, it becomes something less frightening. The other thing we do is try and get positive information out there. So you might have seen some of our postcards. I'm actually going to put some of them out on the desk if you want to take them back to your areas. We're quite free with our information. You can also download it off the Voice Collective website. The t-shirt, Don't Cage Up Your Voices, is one of my favourites, and that was made by a young person who's about 17, 16, I think. No, she was 15, who has very distressing voices. But even at that age, she knew that to cage them up was not the answer. And how awesome is that? It took me until about sort of 5 years ago to get that round my head. So there's a lot of awesome young people who are really inspiring and inspired. And obviously, it also helps that even famous people hear voices. I'm not going to go through it, but maybe you'll recognise a few faces there. But there is a limit to what we can talk about. A limit, because this is all fun, isn't it? It's youth-friendly, it's like, yeah, famous people hear voices too. It's really common. And that's great, but there is a limit. In that, what if people hear voices that tell them to set things on fire? What if they hear voices telling them to hurt their classmates or hurt themselves or kill their family? These are the ones that are much harder to talk about, and especially what happens if the voices talk about sexual themes. If they talk about them hurting themselves sexually or hurting others sexually, that is a giant taboo. She's going to skip through those. I think they're the kind of voices that it's a lot easier to keep out of sight, not because we want to exclude people, but because it's so hard to think about some of those voices. And so I kind of consider them a bit of a taboo within a taboo. And I think, well, why don't we talk about these kinds of voices so much? And I say we because this isn't me bashing services. Just getting that out there. I think in the Hearing Voices Network, there's certain voices we don't talk about either. And certain voices I haven't disclosed in public talks before. About to, but we'll come to that. So this is about why we might find it difficult as a collective, not about professional roles or whether we're users, survivors, professionals, whatever. I think they're associated often with a great deal of shame. I find my sexual voices really hard to talk about because I feel shame. I think they can be linked to other taboo experiences. So for some people, those voices might be linked to things that have happened to them. Not always. Again, let's not make judgments, but they can be linked. And so for me to talk about my taboo voices is to talk about things that I might not feel prepared to open up. It's the unspeakable. I think the content can be difficult to hear and very difficult to speak. We might worry that talking about them could worsen existing stereotypes and prejudices. And what I mean by this is one of the reasons I've stayed silent about some of my more taboo experiences is that I spend a lot of my time showing voice hearing isn't that frightening. If I was to tell people exactly what some of my voices say, that could make that quite difficult for people to get hold of. So if I went into the paper, for example, and talked about voices telling me to kill people, I'm not sure how people would read that. So I can talk about it in safer spaces like this, where I trust you guys. But to be honest, I'm not sure whether I'd want this talk to go out on YouTube. I'm going to have a think about that later, because we are recording it, so we'll see. I think it needs to, but it's a big leap, even for me. I think that the voices sometimes forbid the voice hearer to speak about them. And imagine you're a young person and your voice sounds very powerful and says it will end the world and destroy you if you dare to speak its name. That's a big barrier to get across, isn't it? And I think the psychological understanding of voices sometimes can be a challenge, in that if we see voices as external, then that's nothing to do with me, and that means if I hear a violent or sexual voice, it doesn't mean I'm violent or sexual. But because we think sometimes that voices might be related to what someone might be feeling, parts of themselves, those kind of interpretations, some people can feel that if it's part of me, that means I must be violently sexual, I must be this bad, evil person, or there's a part of that inside me. Of course, we've all got challenging, difficult parts, shadow parts, I guess, shadow selves. But the fear is if we talk about this, that you guys might think that inside there's a sexual predator or something like that, and that feels pretty difficult to deal with. And actually, I have had a young person who talked to their team about their voices, and they told him, be careful, because many people who go on to be abused can become abusers themselves. Not the best thing to say to a young boy. And the fear of what might happen, consequences. If I was to tell you about some of my voices, would I keep my job? Would I be allowed to work with children? If I have children, would I keep my children? And think about young people. It's that a lot of young people I speak to think that even to hear voices means you're going to be carted off and locked up because you're a nutter, inverted commas. So to hear violent voices, that's just like, what are the consequences for talking about that? So we started to hear about these voices after being with Voice Collective for a couple of years, and some of the young people I've been working with for a significant period of time started to open up about them, and that was just really useful actually. It's been really challenging, but it's kind of brought it into focus, and by bringing that into focus it came into our training courses, and we talked with professionals, CAMS workers, early intervention, and found that they were also quite anxious about these voices, and it started to bring it on the agenda. So again, I have to thank the young people that were brave enough to start to talk about it, to help me to think about it, which is a really inverted situation, isn't it? That the people I work with help me think about it as a worker, but also as a person who has these experiences. Why can they push our buttons? And I guess because they do push our buttons, I think. And there might be some of you going, well, I can hear this, it's not a problem. I would question that. No, I would question that, because I think we can hear it, but I think there can still be some button pushing. Some of the voices might trigger certain areas for ourselves, might make us feel uncomfortable or something like that. It could be what they say, how they make us feel, what might happen. So imagine working alongside someone that has sexual voices telling them to, I don't want to say the words in public, but to sexually assault you. Even as to, I'm not sure how much I can say in this forum without upsetting people, but that could make you feel very intimidated, especially if that young person was very taller than you, looked stronger than you. So it's natural to have some kind of concerns. And a lot of it, I feel, is based on fear. And I think we all have this tipping point where we can listen. And I feel that I can listen quite a lot and take a lot and stay reflective and open. But there's a line after which I start to react. I start to get perhaps a bit more prescriptive, a bit more worried, not think quite so clearly. That's not happened so much with young people, but in my prison work, I remember one group in particular where I spent a good couple of hours chasing around the prison trying to sort out something for somebody, because it was pretty extreme, their situation, but it pushed my button. And I started to react instead of sit back and go, okay, what do I do about this? I wasn't in the same headspace that I usually am. So we've all got different lines, but I think we all have them. And I think understanding that is really important. And things can get polarised. We can go into this reaction mode and kind of go into getting drawn to different sides of some extremes. And for me, one of those extremes, when people are talking about these violent or intense voices, one of the polarizations, or the gradients, I guess, can be about the attention that we give to those voices. We might focus on it to the exclusion of everything else and ask the young person, okay, so how are the voices today? What are they saying exactly? Can you tell me? And just only talk about these violent voices. Or we might do the opposite and be really afraid of talking about them and somehow always talk about school, college, the safer topics, because they're safer for them, they're safer for us, and never talk about the content of the voices. We might go into the blame mode, Because I think if a young person is really distressed and if we're feeling a little bit uncomfortable, someone's got to be to blame for that, aren't they? So who do we blame? We might blame the young person and go, they're ultimately quite bad. Hopefully we don't do this. I don't think anyone here would be doing this, but we might, and people in the world may do this. You know, there's something wrong with them, there's something going to happen, they're going to hurt somebody, not because of the pressure on them, but because there's just something wrong with them. So we might blame the person. But often, if we can't blame the young person, and I think we shouldn't blame the young person, we might blame the voice and go, there's bad voices out there, negative voices, it's the voice's fault. Help me battle against your voices. We can work together to beat them, and we can start talking like that, which is understandable. But for me, the challenge here is if we characterise someone's voices as bad, we leave no room for the grey area. What if the young person actually feels really angry and kind of wants to kill the kids at school because they've been badly bullied and badly hurt? And it's natural actually to have angry feelings or revenge fantasies. If we characterise their voices as bad or negative, we don't leave any room for them to tell us that maybe they kind of like it when the voices say that because they feel quite powerful, as well as feeling repulsed about some of the explicitness in the content. So it can become a bit where we've actually told the young person that we can't accept those angry parts of themselves because we can't accept the angry voices. So I think as supporters, it's important that we remain flexible and neutral and open to kind of really be with people and to actually be open to the idea that a young person might feel some of this and they might not, or they might be confused, and it could be challenging. And I don't know, have you ever been characterised as bad? It tends to make you fight against it a little bit or live up to it. So we kind of don't want to make it worse for a young person, I think. In terms of actions, we might use containing responses, using more diagnostic language, because actually diagnostic language can make things feel safer. It's a hallucination, not a voice, gives a bit of distance. Some people might want that distance, and that's okay, but if we jump to that because of our anxiety, that's a different matter. We might overuse medication, we might overuse distraction. I use distraction. Those of us that were in the bar last night, I'm sure we used music and beer. Distraction is not bad, but if it's our only response to these things, it's not a great thing. And the passing the ball response, believing that only the experts can talk about these kind of issues with young people, and then you pass the person to the expert who believes that it's got to be a more expert than them, and a more expert than them. This might sound a bit farcical, but I've seen this happen, and I felt this myself. I'm like, am I the right person? Sometimes we're not the right person for the whole of it. We need many people, we need a team, we need supporters, and we need to play to our own strengths and know our limits. But I think most of us in this room can have a conversation about this, at least, a helpful conversation. So what can we do instead? And I guess for me, the first step really is listening and hearing the stories and recognising how uncomfortable they can make us feel. Make me feel in this kind of forum. And what I'd like to do is tell you briefly about 3 different violent or taboo voices that I hear, out of context, with no story, with no explanation as whether I acted or didn't act on them, and just let them hang for a minute and ask you if you're willing to, just to think about what it's like to hear them. And then I'll give you some story. It's not going to be too bad, but having said that, zone off if you need to, walk out if you need to, it's cool. I'm not going to over-explicitize it, I promise. I'm building up, you're going to be like, that's not really very violent. What are you talking about, Ray? I'll start with the easy one, and this is the alien. Those who've heard me before know that I had what I believe to be an alien inside me when I was younger, when I was about 14, that this was growing and trying to take over me. And what this alien used to do when I was in hospital is it would speak to me and it would tell me that it was the only one that knew me, but that it was going to make me kill people, that I was bad. It was going to take over my body, make me kill people. And I believed that I had. It showed me visions of people that I'd murdered. And then one day I was on level 1 observation where, someone's arm's width from you. The voice was telling me to explicitly murder the nursing assistant who was observating me. Technical term. It's okay if you don't know it. And see, humour, it's a great recourse, isn't it? it told me to explicitly, in detail, how to murder this person. And I obviously tried to back away from her. She went towards me. I was like, the alien wants me to kill you, or some sort of garble that probably doesn't make anyone feel very comfortable around someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And I ended up obviously secluded, injected, and the usual stuff. It was a bit of a mess. That's not that hard to hear, is it? It might be if you've gone through it, because there's some hard aspects to that, but it's not that explicit. The next one is a bit more difficult. And can you see the little kitten? That's Ripley. She is so cute. She's one of my kittens. And one day I was stroking my cat, my beautiful little kitten who was very, very tiny, just stroking her. And I could feel underneath my hand her bones breaking, her tiny little beautiful bones breaking. And I could hear a voice telling me to snap her neck, to break her bones, and yeah, talking about how I could destroy and crush and mutilate this kitten. Next one. The next one is the hardest, and so I'm going to skirt over it because I'm not sure I feel safe to go into great detail with it. But I think it's important that we talk about these kind of voices, because as I've started to talk about them, an overwhelming number of people that hear voices have come up to me and gone, yeah, I get that too. And I think the lack of talking is a real problem. And this would be, having my niece and nephew over, my lovely, lovely niece and nephew, who at this stage were like 4 and 6, little kids. Me looking after them for the first time as their auntie, being kind of like excited, but also making all the rookie mistakes of childcare. You know, but we can't go to bed yet, we need a bath. Okay, we'll have a bath. Oh no, bad mistake. They just got so excited. So I've got a bit of a way to go before I get the whole childcare skills down. But while they were in the bath, I started to hear these voices telling me that they were dirty, that they deserved to be abused. And worse than that, telling me to abuse them, again in quite explicit ways. That's all I'll say about that. But that sucks, doesn't it? It sucks to hear. It's hard to hear. But if I was to tell you more about that, I imagine you'd have some reactions. One, because you might have children, nieces and nephews, and know kind of how awful it would be to have that experience. But imagine you didn't know me, and I was talking about that. You might have some other reactions. If you might have gone through your own journey with trauma, as I have, you might have a kind of an instinctive revulsion. Some people I tell this to have really, it's the cat story that gets them the most, because I had the impulse to kill my cat. It wasn't just a voice. I didn't have the impulse to abuse my niece and nephew. That was a voice. But the cat one was an impulse. And they kind of imagine what that would be like and just have lots of feelings towards it. So if we were in a proper training session, we'd be talking here about, well, what is that like? But I think it's hardest because we don't know the context. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the context in the story. As you probably have gathered, I went through a lot of trauma in my childhood, and that trauma left me with stuff. And for me, I don't want to go too far into the me because there's a whole point to this talk that isn't about me, that my voices carry a lot of the memories, a lot of the feelings, a lot of the anger, a lot of the stuff that I went through that I don't carry myself. So I'm very fortunate that I hear these voices that tell me these things, because it allows me to be me. And what I'm having to do now in my journey is start to kind of listen more to them and work it out and communicate with them, which is what one of my presentations was on yesterday. But just to give context to where these particular voices come from, the first one, the alien, was not the abusers, it's not all that kind of stuff, it was the abuse, the violation, the feelings that I was bad inside, that I could hurt people. For me, that's one of the places that came from. Didn't actually kill anyone, it's cool. They were visions. No, definitely visions. The second one, the Kill Kitty voice, is actually a child, a little girl, and it was because part of the legacy of my trauma is I'm not always in contact with my body, had to have a medical procedure because of that, which was very personal. Again, I'm going around the edges because you don't need to hear about these things. But needless to say, it re-traumatized me, or re-traumatized part of me. And when I got home from that, I think my voice felt so vulnerable that she both wanted to destroy anything that was vulnerable because vulnerable is dangerous, but was also angry at the kitten for being able to be vulnerable. So she kind of wanted to, just, like a kid when someone hurts them or they hurt themselves, what do? They kick something or they hit something. It's that kind of response. So what I did to deal with that, after feeling really freaked out for a while, to be honest, is I got a boxing bag, some wraps, started to punch things, sounds bad, doesn't it? But started to do some boxing because it helped remind my voice and myself that I'm in an adult body. And that isn't the thing for me at the moment. I'm not that child. I've got that child within me, but it's a different time zone. And I started to kind of not hate that voice, but try and really empathize with that voice and just have a different relationship. And then finally, the most difficult voices, the not yets, which are represented by the masks. They are obviously what was said to me and what was said around me. That's obvious, but that for me isn't a satisfactory explanation because to carry that with me all the time is really hard. So what else could they be? And for me, I think of them as a frightened child. Monster girl lives with monsters. If you're in that situation, sometimes you have to say or be a way that you don't believe. Be a monster and then you won't get attacked. And I feel that those voices that say that are little frightened children that don't yet know it's safe. They're parts of me that are still there. And so it's my responsibility as an adult to reach out to those parts of myself and try and be gentle with them whilst they're the hardest voices that I hear. And this backdrop, this kind of context will hopefully make the rest of the talk give a bit more sense. It's how do we be compassionate towards the voices that are most challenging, but most importantly, how can we understand that young people might not want to be compassionate to those voices as well? So it's how do we not enforce compassion on people? Because actually it's natural to want to get rid of those voices. It's natural to hate them. It's natural to want to stamp them out. And so it's how do we balance those conversations so that we're not going too far to the voices are great, yay voices, it's cool, to the voices are evil. There's a middle ground, isn't there, somewhere? And I think for me, it's partly about changing how we think about what we might call violent voices and thinking about them in different ways. If they're not the enemy, what else could they be? It's a hard question, and some of the ideas that have come up in training that I've done around this involve that sometimes they could be understood as a metaphor. They could be a reminder to protect yourself from harm, past or present. One of my voices, Elfie, when I'm doing talks like this, she used to give me visions of me stabbing myself. Pretty hard to concentrate, admittedly, when that's happening. But I used to hate her so much because I just wanted to be able to do talks. I didn't want this. But actually, what she was saying is there was someone in the audience that I didn't know, I didn't feel safe with, that I felt was wearing a mask. And if you don't know people and they're wearing a mask, not a literal mask, metaphorical mask, she was reminding me that I didn't feel safe to be talking because she didn't feel safe to be talking. And so I wasn't listening to her feelings of lack of safety, so she had to up the ante. It's like the voice equivalent of yelling fire and chucking things around the room to get us out of that. She was upping the ante to get me to listen to her. Now I do. She gets a bit freaked out, I nod to her, we have a bit of a chat, and I don't get the stabbing experiences that I used to get. So it was a reminder to protect myself. A vessel to hold anger and other emotions that feel too difficult to bear. A really understandable response to betrayal and trauma. I think, these voices and these experiences and these feelings are understandable. And maybe a message to ourselves or others that can be understood. There's nothing like a violent voice as a call to action, and going, there's something here that we need to deal with. Again, not assuming that everyone that has these experiences has gone through the trauma that I have, but it certainly says there's something is a call to action. And an opportunity for healing. Weirdest thing that I never thought I would say is I would honour, God, that sounds cheesy, doesn't it? But I kind of honour even the voices that I still find very difficult, because without them, I would be dealing with this stuff myself. I probably wouldn't be able to work, I wouldn't be able to have relationships, because I'd be consumed with all of my history. So I'm very thankful that they hold some of that for me. Even though I'd kind of like us to have a different relationship, I'm working on that still. Definitely not coming here as a guru. I think another step is to rethink risk calmly and go, well, is it about what the voices say that increases or decreases the risk, or is it other things? And I'm guessing most of you guys, it's like preaching to the choir at this point, because I'm guessing you guys think like this a lot anyway. But I think things that increase risk, isolation, exclusion, victimization, being backed into a corner, because if you're backed into a corner either by your voices or by society or anything, you might hide in that corner, but also it's natural to feel you have to push back. I think that increases risks. Having nothing to lose, hopelessness, drugs and alcohol, not because drugs and alcohol are bad kids, but because it's a different state of consciousness, a different kind of headspace to be in, where sometimes we can't sit back and think things through clearly. Believing in the voices and taking it 100% literally. I believe that voices are real just as part of the hearing voices movement. This isn't a me thing, this is what we often say. Not because we believe we have to believe them and what they say, but we believe that the person hears them and that they're a real experience. But that doesn't mean that they always tell the truth. So there's sometimes other ways of seeing them. Obviously, the things that decrease the risk are the opposite. Space to talk, social support, connections, validation, having realistic options. All of this stuff is societal and social. It's about creating communities where people feel valued, feel connected, that feel that there's a reason to battle sometimes and to carry on and resist some things. And that's something I think in youth services that people have been doing for a long time, creating this possibility. I think the challenge is, you remember the riots in London? I think the challenge is here that actually a lot of the things that were helping people feel included and part of society got taken away, and that obviously led to something really not good. And I feel that the same with voices. If we're creating communities and supportive spaces, that's obviously going to help a young person. And just to take it away from me, I'm going to talk about Jack. Jack doesn't exist. He's not one of my voices, but he doesn't exist. He's imaginary, but he's based on a culmination of stuff, but I don't feel it's appropriate for me to talk about a young person that I've worked with and the kind of personal experiences they've gone through, because that just would be a bit harsh, actually. It's hard enough talking about my own. So Jack is 17. He's been hearing 2 voices since he was 15, Abe and brackets. Whilst Jack feels okay talking about Abe, who's really distracts him and repeats what Jack considers garbage, he finds it really, really difficult to talk about brackets. Jack finds brackets very threatening. He sounds very powerful, speaking with a booming voice about the insects he considers the human race to be. He tells Jack that he's an insignificant worm, and an insignificant worm that begs to be destroyed. He says that Brackets is the only one that knows him. Brackets speaks of the violence of humans and tries to explicitly goad Jack into giving into his true nature by hurting children. Brackets forbids Jack to speak his name, saying that his human tongue would simply dirty it. So, very powerful voice. I don't know about you, but when I read that, part of me just wants to slap Brackets and just say, stop it, leave Jack alone. I feel quite protective of Jack in this fictitious kind of story. And I think often when I work alongside people, whether they're adults or young people, the kind of process I often think about is there's got to be a spark, a reason. Why are we going to have this conversation? Do you want to talk to me? What do you want to be doing? The connection. We need a spark sometimes. We then tend to explore things and go, where do you want to explore? It's their territory, their land, their world. And if they've chosen to chat with me as kind of like a guide or a random person along the way, this is awesome. But we have to work out where do we want to explore, because I don't know this world. And then we might do some mapping and try and make sense of some of the lands that we've explored, you know. Kind of, the map is not the territory, but it's kind of useful, isn't it? And then think about the spark. Do you want to go anywhere else? What have we learned? Where do we want to go? And underneath that is obviously paying attention to safety. But think about Jack. There's a major issue here, isn't there? Working in this way, there's a giant block, lots of barriers. How do we even get the spark, let alone any exploration or anything like that? And you can feel a bit stuck. And I think the first is finding a reason and working alongside Jack, inverted commas, to actually decide whether or not he wants to open up and explore and look at this voice that he finds so difficult. I think testimonies of people that have done this. So Jackie, Ron, Eleanor. I want one from a plumber as well, not just as the standard in the mental health world, but people from lots of different backgrounds. So if you know any voice hearer plumbers that want to write their narrative, send it to the Hearing Voices Network, because we need a wider pool here. I do want to be a plumber as well, but I just don't have the technical mind for that. But just to know that other people can be part of that. To talk about what might it be like if we did do that could be kind of good. But the idea is there being a real informed choice about whether or not he has that conversation. And if he chooses not to, we have to respect that. Because, as you guys I'm sure know, to push someone into talking about something that they're not ready to talk about is kind of dangerous. That increases the risk more than anything. We need to go with people, not pushing them. And we need to think about safety, obviously. And I'm going to skip through this because I'm guessing you guys know lots about safety, but I think partly around promoting safety, and I'm not meaning like reducing risk safety, I'm meaning the person themselves, the young person feeling safe in the space, feeling able to do this stuff and to do this thing that feels very, very risky and overwhelming. How do we promote safety? And I think part of it is about being as non-judgmental as possible, because actually we all make judgments. I'm sure you guys have made judgments about me and each other. We're humans, judgments are natural. But trying to really not enforce those judgments on others and not hold them too tightly. So if a young person hears people talk about someone in the news and go, yeah, well, they're really bad, why would they then have a conversation with you about some things of themselves that they feel bad? So I think it's something about what we do in our day-to-day lives, and living this more open approach is really cool. I think obviously dealing with our own anxiety, the confidentiality spiel people do originally, this is confidential unless there's something that makes me worry about your safety or the safety of others, and then I'll have to blah, blah, blah. It has to be done, I have to do it. This is the weird thing about like being in many worlds at once. But there's something about that spiel that is a block. What is it? Well, if my voices are telling me to hurt others, and part of me kind of feels like I want to, that immediately means that confidentiality will be breached, or it sounds like it will from that spiel. So it's sometimes about really modifying the confidentiality spiel and going, but I know lots of people that hear voices that say quite a lot of intense things. That doesn't mean I jump to like panic mode. If there's something that's concerning me, we will have a chat about it. This is what we'll do, and just make it a little bit more detailed. I think options is good. One of the best things I've ever done, and I don't do very many good things, I think. I'm not like super... I had this conversation about expertise and experts with a few people, and I'm not an expert. Everyone has expertise. But one of the things I'm proud of in the way that I work is that the first thing I often say is, I'm a random stranger. Don't say it exactly like this, but you don't have to be here if you don't want to be here. If at any point you want to leave, this is cool. If you want to come back, this is cool too. But it's one of the first things I say, which always feels a bit like telling a young person, get out of here, I don't want to see you. But for somehow people tend to say that was one of the most useful things. It might mean everything else we do is not useful, I admit that. But yeah, we have to give real choice and we have to mean it. Checking out how the voice hearer and the voices feel about talking, thinking about a safe space, where are you going to have the conversation? Thinking about safety strategies of if it gets difficult, how will I know? What will we do? And I've had to really learn not to assume that someone expressing emotion is a reason for me to panic and stop the conversation, but to rather say, hey, this is looking like it's pretty difficult right now. How do you feel about that? Do you want to continue? Do you want a little break? What should we do? Because I used to stop conversations way too soon, and I think all I was giving was the message that I can't hear your pain, which is not great. Going in and out, talking about film, and then also talking about some of the difficulties. Being stuck in this intense space can feel too much, so being able to dip in and out shows that we can dip in and out of this stuff. I think remembering about the violent impulses too, and actually checking out how the voices are doing in the conversation, how the person's doing. I think one of the challenges about hearing and talking about voices is the idea of sirens and Pandora's box. With sirens, it's the idea that if we even listen to them, we'll get sucked in. And I think these voices can sometimes feel like sirens. So I think it's kind of... there's some real reasons we can be concerned about even opening this up in any way and just listening, and reasons the young person might not want to go there because of fear of overwhelm. I think it's important to respect that fear, because those walls that stop us from talking or listening or even knowing what the voices are saying, because we can't tell you because we're not able to listen to it, they're there for a reason. So I think going gently is really cool. And if you want to go gently, these are some of the starting points I found useful. I think increasing distance, which is like anything that gives Jack a sense of distance or detachment when trying to talk about brackets. And that could be writing in the third person about a boy that hears something. It might be using storytelling, puppets, becoming an observer, which sometimes I do, which is when things are very hard, it's like I step out and go, once upon a time there was, or there's this person who's trying to talk about this voice, but the voice is not liking it. It's just some way of increasing that distance. Using visualization, metaphor, focusing on specifics, so rather than focusing on the whole voice, which can be really, really overwhelming, choosing a specific feature, and that's obviously the young person choosing that. So it might be the tone of voice, the age, words, feeling, the pitch, the change in tone from room to room, the placement, distance, when it starts and stops, even putting up your hands, just anything that feels safe to that person. And you don't know what that's going to be, because actually talking about whether it's male or female might be a huge thing. So you might, so we can't assume that it's going to be okay. We have to be led by people. I think time. Maybe even obviously in the Hearing Voices Network, we often talk about setting limits in terms of listening for 30 seconds, listening for 5 seconds, having an alarm or something, because there is that once you start listening, it can be hard to withdraw if you're feeling overwhelmed. Having a kind of grounding strategy or something, a ritual almost, that you do when you stop listening can kind of be useful, and that your supporter can help you do that. I count from 10 to 0 and then say blast off like a kind of NASA space person. That sounds really cheesy, doesn't it? But it really, really helps bring me back into the room. I will say that when I do that, sometimes I'm jumping around when I get to blast off. I'm not going to do this in this space, don't worry. But it's whatever it is that helps the person. And I think place and predictability can be cool. So it's knowing that you can leave it behind, that this isn't going to infiltrate the rest of your life. It might make it feel safe. And again, that ritual about kind of what we do before we start listening, what we do after we start listening can be useful. In terms of expressing, because actually once you've even started to pay attention to bits of it, the next thing might be starting to express it. Some of the ideas I've got, at least that I use, Russian dolls. So drawing Russian dolls, I haven't got the wherewithal to create them, unfortunately. But the outer layer I draw as the kind of the voice that I'm most afraid of and what that looks like and feels like. But then I think, well, what might be underneath that? And for me, I need about 2 months between each doll. It's a work in progress, because underneath the shiny hematite surface, there was anger and fire and things that I couldn't go near. And then there was pain and there was this, and I'm still going, there's a lot of Russian dolls in my collection. Unfortunately, I'm not a great artist, otherwise I'd show you them, but they probably wouldn't. They're better when I talk about it, to be fair. Physical expression, because actually it's not all about talking about these voices. Sometimes it's about getting it out physically. Externalizing the content. I write my stuff down in speech bubbles a lot of the time because it makes it feel safe. So you'll see me on the tube. Hopefully you won't see me on the tube. I'm very discreet. If one of those sexualized voices is talking and I'm finding it hard, I'll write it down privately. Don't think people notice, but write down what they say to get it out, because inside it feels too much. And then I'll write down a reply, thinking about what cheesy kind of Rufus May kind of thing to do, but this idea of like, what might a wise part of myself say to what might I want to say back to that. If you're working with a young person, I've done this when we thought, well, what might we want to say? Or who is wise in your life? Is it your mum? Is it somebody else? And what can we do to reply? Externalizing and deciding what to do with the results of this. I had one young person that created a paper version of one of her scary, inverted commas, scary voices, and asked what did she want to do with it, imagining she was going to smash it or something, or do something, rip it up. That's what I figured. What she wanted to do was give it a backstory, which is so cool. And we talked about the backstory, and she was saying about how this monster, she said it was a monster, was bullied in its own land and it was misunderstood. And then she kept this monster on the shelf. So it's whatever the young person wants to do. Yeah. writing a creative story, screaming, shouting, so many things. I love the idea of choosing photos, images, or music. We had a young person's group where we all thought about music that represents how we feel, how our voices feel. And that was really cool. I realised that I'm very old, so I don't know a lot of the music of the youth of today. I really don't. But that was cool as well, because then they got to teach me. It's kind of cool. Still haven't learnt very much. Creating a circle where each voice has a space to share how they're feeling. This is something I do because I'm very good at not listening to my voices, and I'm very good at just working hard. So I draw a circle. In each circle, there's space for one of the voices, and there's a space for me too. And I just try and listen to that voice for a little bit of time to think about what are they saying, what do they feel, so I can get this overview and then think, actually, is there a voice that's really in a lot of pain or angry or yelling, and what am I going to do about that? Yeah, with young people, I quite like making scrapbooks. Here's a couple of my pretend scrapbooks. I'm not giving you the real ones because they're getting a bit too personal. This is Blue, one of my child voices. This is Kill Kitty voice. She's not really Kill Kitty voice, that was just part of her. And then Elfie, the one that used to send me stabbing visions. But it's trying to get, rather than voice profiling, which is a very sort of logical way of looking at voices with the Hearing Voices movement, this is more like ripping up magazines and going on Google Images and getting uncopyrighted images to kind of put into your scrapbook. And I think ultimately it's about transforming power relationships and having flexibility in those. And this is really difficult. So actually, if you're just expressing and helping people feel that they're okay and not weird or bad, this is good. But for me, I think it's about finding a different way of having this relationship. And if we think back to Jack, with this voice that partly, in all honesty, I kind of want to squish and get rid of and help Jack, which is my protector, you know, it's my fixer. I've got a fixer. I try and not channel it too much. What else could brackets be? Some possibilities. Because we think about relationship, we have a relationship and how we are to the other person, teacher, student, that kind of thing. At the moment, we've got brackets and Jack. Brackets is like the overlord, and Jack is the worm or the insect. That's a very stuck relationship, but what else could it be? Jack could be brackets' teacher. Bit of a leap, isn't it? How could this work? Okay, well, actually it sounds like brackets is from another galaxy, another planet. He sees humans as worms and says that the world is violent and has this particular view of humanity. Well, what if Jack goes, well, you know what? And we're talking with Jack, and you know what? Brackets has a point. There is a lot of violence in the world. People don't treat each other very well. But actually, is that all there is to the world? And maybe Jack wants to think about good and evil and have like an ethical discussion. 17. Ethical discussions can happen at 17, I've heard. And maybe he discovers that some beauty in the world too. And then he might want to teach brackets that actually, yeah, there is violence, but there's something else too. He might want to be a translator for the universe, for the world. Actually, Jack might want to be an explorer, because it sounds like brackets is asking some real serious questions in a very difficult way. So maybe Jack might use that to explore how he feels about violence. Jack might be an older brother, because actually brackets might sound very powerful, but maybe he's just a little child. He's really angry and hurt. Brackets is very solid, he might be the rock, but maybe Jack could be the water, and water might feel very insignificant, but it shapes rocks, doesn't it, over time? So maybe the rock can change, there can be some movement. Maybe brackets is a reminder, and Jack is there to listen, but not to fully be absorbed by. Violent voices always have a context, obviously. We just need to not jump to an idea of what that context will be, and the idea that we know what that context is. It's the young person's life, and I really believe that in their time they'll work it out. But for me, my mind, we're just there to be there along the journey. I'll leave you with some wise words from Dolly Sen, who is amazing. Do check her out, her films and just her speeches and her books. Says, my voices are the sanest part of me. The madness is not listening to their pain. And Dolly often talks about how when she was about 14, she had a voice telling her to stab her father's eyes out, and that she was told she'd end up in Broadmoor. She didn't end up in Broadmoor. She's now training as an OT, but apart from that, she's very nice. No, I do like the occupational therapy profession. Sorry for any OTs in the room. But yeah, she's now this amazingly creative and inspiring woman. And part of it was listening to the pain of her voices. not going to play Eminem, but check out Eminem, Make Friends with the Monster. Thank you very much, and I hope that some of this has been vaguely useful. Certainly do check out Voice Collective, all behind the label, my own website. And yeah, we've got a little bit of time for questions, so we started slightly late, but if anyone wants to ask anything, I'm willing to do that. Also, if you want me to get rid of myself, that's cool too.